Welcome back to Aramarche in France for our special D-Day night. A band playing 40s big band music there in the square. Some brave souls listening to them in the rain. And here we're joined now by Harry Mason, a veteran who served in the Normandy campaign with the Royal Army Medical Corps. We also welcome Simon True, a military historian from the Department of War Studies at Sandhurst. Colonel Tim Collins, Nicholas Rankin are still with us. And as we've seen in that film, it's hard to believe that young men could cope with the kind of conditions we were seeing there, landing on the beaches. But Simon True, before the landing on the beaches, was the airdrop. The parachutists coming out of gliders and out of planes. Tell us a bit about that.
Well, it was absolutely essential to the success of the invasion. They had to secure the flanks at the base of the Cotentin Peninsula and then over on the eastern side of the River Orne. So it was absolutely critical, and the guys were very well trained for this. They had to be. They were jumping from as low as 100 metres in some cases. So, you know, they've only got a very short distance before they hit the earth. But of course, the problems were considerable. We talked earlier on about the weather conditions, and the weather conditions were very marginal. They were jumping in wind speeds above those that were actually appropriate for the drop. They encountered German flak as they crossed the coast. They encountered low cloud and mist and so forth, which broke up the formations.
I mean, some of them were dropped in the wrong place, weren't they?
They were very badly dispersed. In fact, only a minority of the airborne forces actually landed on the drop zones or the landing zones where they were actually supposed to land. But of course, this actually worked to the Allies' advantage in some ways, because it made it difficult for the Germans to work out where the main effort was on the morning of D-Day.
Now the point of the airdrop, as you say, was to secure the flanks and basically to stop the Germans sending in reinforcements to help the chaps who are landing here on the beaches, as you were, Harry. I mean, is there any sense with the air landings that it was a bit of a cock-up? You know, I mean, you say it was a bit to their advantage because the Germans didn't know where they were going to be.
That's right.
But, you know, gliders were crashing. I mean, there's one terrible eyewitness report of a plane that went in too low and a parachutist on the ground said, I saw the chaps falling out and they just hit the ground. The sound was like watermelons smacking on the ground.
That's right, that's right. I mean, some of them are jumping too low and they just don't have time for their parachutes to deploy. But I mean, they do make a significant contribution despite the fact that they're so badly dispersed. Enough of them rally, they're highly trained individuals, they exercise initiative and they go about their missions, coming together, as it were, like droplets of water coming down a windscreen at the bottom.
Now, Tim Collins, let's talk a bit about the landings that took place, you know, behind us here at Gold Beach and, of course, Omaha and Utah and Sword and Juno Beach in the other direction. I mean, obviously, you've got a huge experience of what's going through men's minds as they go into battle. I mean, give us an idea of what would be going through the men's minds as they were coming to face what they faced here.
Well, remember that essentially it doesn't matter if you're on a glider or if you're on a boat. Really, those are a vehicle to get you there, and you realise it's going to be dangerous. And indeed, we as a regiment had two battalions. 1st Ulster Rifles landed with the 6th Airborne Brigade by gliders. The 2nd Battalion, led by Tommy Harris, landed in Sword Beach. And what you really want to do is get away from the vehicle. You want to get off it. You're waiting the whole time and get on with your job. And so really, there was an officer who famously said on Sword Beach that the only people who are going to stay on this beach are the people who are dead and the people who are going to die. So the whole trick is to get off the beach, get to where you need to be, and then begin your operation. And that's all about training. It's a lot about luck too. But as we heard earlier, the weather didn't help. Some of the troops were dropped too early, and indeed, during the landings of the 2nd Battalion Ulster Rifles, the commanding officer's Batman went in and discovered that they'd landed on a sandbank, and he disappeared and lost his bicycle, which I think Tommy then made him pay for.
Seems a bit harsh in the circumstances.
Discipline must be maintained. But it is... so there was a number of aspects to that. It was difficult, and people were carrying a lot of gear. Parachutists typically... a parachutist who would typically be about 10 stone in weight was carrying something like 28 stone of equipment on the aircraft. You're jumping at 300 feet. You've got 18 seconds in the air, during which you've got to leave the aircraft, try and not collide with another parachute, lower your equipment. So if you land with your equipment attached to your legs, you've got 2 broken legs, and then get on with the fight. So it's all very fast and furious.
But when it works, it's really good. If you go to Pegasus Bridge, you see that Howard's glider lands about 60 feet from the bridge. He thought he'd gone blind because his helmet had fallen over his head. And then he recovered. They came out, they seized the bridge, and then they seized the other one over the canal, Ham and Jam, and they'd got them. They'd stopped these 2 vital bridges and held them.
And Simon, here at the beach, I mean, what would the scene have been that would have greeted? I mean, I know it differed somewhat from beach to beach, Omaha, of course, being the bloodiest. But
That's right.
what would have greeted the first wave as
Yes.
the ramp of the landing craft went down?
Well, you're right. It did vary, actually, on Gold Beach. The first troops ashore at the eastern end of Gold Beach managed to cross a large part of the beach before they came under any fire whatsoever. But then, of course, the Germans had preset lines of fire, so you couldn't cross through these things without coming under fire from some position or another. Artillery starts to fall on the beach, mortar rounds and so forth, and then, of course, formations begin to dissolve, and it's down to the courage and the initiative of individuals to make things work.
I mean, some of these men are seeing their colleagues, their commanders, falling beside them. You know, some people stood up off the landing craft to get off, were shot instantly. I mean, the thing that occurs to me is, I mean, the courage these men must have shown. I mean, Tim, how do you prepare men for that kind of assignment? And how do you know, how do they know that they're going to have the courage to go through with it? I mean, there must have been someone who just didn't want to get off.
Well, I should think that the vast majority of people didn't really want to do it. It's a pretty unnatural thing, but at that time we had a very complex regimental system which was really ingrained in the tribes of the United Kingdom. And so, and even today, and certainly when I led my battalion invasion of Iraq, it's very much appealing to their sense of comradeship and regimental spirit, that they don't want to let their mates down. They would rather die than let their mates down. And the trick is to keep them thinking about each other, and then the realization that once they're in action, hope that they're going to do better. And what you tend to find in regiments is that the vast majority of people do as it says on the tin. They perform as you expected. An extraordinary number of unlikely characters do extraordinary things. People who you might have considered maybe throwing out of the army because they're a bit of a nuisance downtown or they're a bit lazy around barracks become extraordinary heroes. But it's also very rare, in the very rare cases, there are people who frankly crumble, people who you have high expectations of, who simply don't perform on the day. And I think one of the most important things for a commander is to realize when a group isn't being well led, when somebody has lost it, and quickly replace them in order to get that leadership back on, and then you see them as a body rising again.
Well, Harry, you were the equivalent of a male nurse in the medical corps, and you were brought on to this beach here, weren't you?
Yes.
4 days after the landing.
About 10 days afterwards, yeah.
About 10 days afterwards.
When the beaches were clear.
And you were brought on to deal with cases of men, as Tim says, who had crumbled.
Yes.
And who... Now, it wasn't called shell shock, was it?
Well,
in
a lot of them
instances?
were, yes, they were. But there was more severe cases than others, you know. And we were trained, really, to deal with this situation.
And how did it manifest itself, the kind of trauma that they were experiencing? I mean,
Well-
how did they appear to you?
Well, some of them appeared normal, but some of them appeared as though they were in another world altogether. They were bewildered by what had happened when they came back from the front. And more severe cases were kept for a while before they were sent back home.
And some were sent back, though, weren't they,
Some
to
were,
fight
yes,
again?
yeah. The more severe cases were, yeah. They were,
But what about, I mean, were some people kept for a week or two and then sent back to fight?
yeah, about three weeks, something similar to that. And if the psychiatrist deemed that they were fit to go back, they would go back.
And presumably some of them would have been desperate not to go back. That would have been the last thing they wanted.
Yes, it wasn't cowardice by any means. It wasn't cowardice, no. There was an illness there, which makes, at the time, it didn't appear that there was a problem there, but there was a problem with them mentally because of the situation they were in.
Yeah.
I think it's something we saw in the First World War. I know at Canterbury Cathedral there's a memorial to Mickey Mannock. He was born in County Cork, and he won a Victoria Cross, 2 Distinguished Service Orders and a Military Cross. Was killed in 1918 in April, just before the end of the First World War, but he famously wept before he got into his aircraft. But he still got into his aircraft and flew, and his horror was dying in fire, and he was last seen going across enemy lines on fire. These people will push themselves forward, but we must understand that there's some people who just run out of their bottle of energy, and that's not their fault. This is a combat wound which we now recognise, but you cannot see, and that's why organisations like Combat Stress are crucial.
I mean, courage, though, is not about not being frightened, is it? It's about being frightened and still
dealing
doing
with it.
your job.
And that's exactly the point I'm trying to make, that Mickey Mannock wept so much that the collar of his shirt was famously wet, but he was still able to climb into his aircraft and destroy other German aircraft. He didn't want to go. Other people cannot physically get themselves off the ground. That's not their fault. This is a real wound.
And then we have to think about the First World War, because people like Wilfred Owen, another one who died just before the end of the war, up in Edinburgh at Craig Lockhart, where they were dealing with shell-shocked officers and sending them back into the line. In some way, they sort of re-earthed them and then sent them back. You had to deal with it.
But Harry, I'm interested that you say, it wasn't cowardice, and certainly none of us here, certainly not me, would ever judge those men.
No.
But presumably there must have been, those who were fighting alongside them, for whom the idea that they would somehow carry on, but the man beside them would crumble, would be, it would feel like a betrayal.
Yeah.
And also it meant that therefore the person who was still standing would have to do even more and risk even more. So there must have been, was there not some anger about it, or,
Not really, no. They got on with the job, yeah. They were trained to do it, and to the best of their ability, and they did do it.
So those who were retired from the front, who had, it was called a kind of war neurosis, wasn't it, at the time?
Yes.
So they were treated always entirely sympathetically? It's kind of hard to believe, really.
Yeah, the psychiatrists were very good. You can't complain about the treatment they got at all. It was very, very good.
And Simon, Omaha, if we're going to talk about war neurosis or crumbling, Omaha was the bloodiest of battles. Why was it so difficult at Omaha?
Well, yes, you're right. 4,500 or more young Americans became casualties at Omaha, compared to, say, 1,000 at Gold Beach, which is bad enough. 4,500 in one place. It was very well defended. But it's really the topography of Omaha. It has dominating ground overlooking the beaches, and the beach curves around so that gun positions at either end can fire along the beach effectively. Nobody can cross the beach without crossing through a beaten zone of fire. So it makes it very difficult to do so. Now, of course, the Allies had a preliminary bombardment to try to prevent the full effects of the German defence.
But quite a lot of it fell in the wrong place, didn't it?
It missed, that's right, because again the weather conditions were not optimum by any means.
Simon, isn't it important too that the dual duplex tanks, the floating tanks, all the ones destined for Omaha Beach, sank?
Well, but this is interesting, because at the eastern end of Omaha, that was true. The one supporting the 1st Infantry Division sank. But at the western end, they were all delivered onto the beach, because the commanders of the landing craft assault decided that the weather was so bad that they couldn't risk putting them into the sea. But even at the western end, it didn't make any difference, because the Germans are so well dug in.
And what about, you talk about the floating tanks. I can't for the life of me imagine what a floating tank is like. It seems an oxymoron. But because I know you've written about the ingenuity of all of they were called Hobart's funnies, weren't they?
Well, ingenuity and engineering go together, really.
And they were devised by, just explain why they're called Hobart's funnies. Well, devised by what, Percy Hobart, wasn't it?
Yes, but Churchill supported this man, who was quite an eccentric general. He plucked him out from being a corporal in the Home Guard he'd previously been, and then put him in charge of developing new weapons to get ashore. We've got to think that you're landing here. Rommel wanted to defend this with millions of mines, wire, trenches, huge holes. He wanted 6 miles deep. And so these engines, they were called a menagerie because they had animal names, to flail their way, crabs and lobsters, to flail their way through minefields. You had these Churchill cannons with a flying dustbin that fired 60 yards, a huge explosive charge. You had fascines that were dropped into ditches. You had Bailey bridges on rockets that fired over. So all these crawling creatures to climb through the wire, the trenches, and Hobart's funnies, they were called, because they were bizarre. The crocodile, for example, was a flamethrower. They weren't here on D-Day. They came in a few days later. This was a mixture of petrol and rubber and latex, and it fired 180 yards. It was terrifying.
And how did the Germans react to them?
Well, they ran away with those, and they didn't like many of these things. They really encouraged, when these creatures turned up, particularly the petards that could destroy bunkers, a lot of the infantry liked that. When their big friends went away at night, they were less happy.
And of course, these tanks were these were lifesavers. One of the lessons that Percy Hobart, who incidentally was Bernard Law Montgomery's brother-in-law, learned was that the failure at Dieppe was because ordinary tanks fit for battle were not suited to cross the terrain behind us.
Well, let's just remind people, because not everyone will be necessarily familiar with Dieppe, but Dieppe was in 1942, wasn't it? And it was a sort of raid.
Yes, it was a combined
Dieppe.
operations
It was never
raid.
expected to be an invasion, but it failed terribly, causing great loss of life.
Well,
didn't
it
it?
was
We went back with our
primarily
tail between our legs.
it was the career high at that time of Lord Louis Mountbatten, but it was also it was essentially a Canadian raid, and they, the 1st Canadian Division, were desperate to do something. They had turned up, and we must remember that the Canadians declared war the same day that the United Kingdom declared war over the issue of Poland. Even though they were 3,000 miles away, they stepped up to the plate on the very day. And by 1942, they hadn't done anything, and they were desperate to get involved. But tragically, this raid, but I have to say that my personal belief would be that the success of D-Day couldn't have happened without the bitter lessons we learned at Dieppe.
That you needed naval gunfire, you needed rockets, you needed tanks that could climb walls. They just got stuck. You see them, they're all on the beach. And so there were huge lessons learned from Dieppe, I think.
Okay, well, gentlemen, and you at home, as we've just heard, for the assault to work, preparation was all important. And here we see the detailed and fastidious work of the thousands of volunteers in Britain and in France who constructed the incredibly accurate maps crucial to the invasion. And we'll be back in 30 minutes.